Hello and welcome to today's mini lecture on the theme of Undersea Geopolitics. My name is Rachael Squire and I'm a lecturer in kind of human and political geography here at Royal Holloway, University of London. And just by way of introduction, my research has focused primarily on the space of the sea and the various ways that human geography unfolds within these spaces, whether that be through the practices and economy of container shipping, exploring how we can use diving as a method to kind of attune ourselves to the underwater world, thinking about contested spaces like Gibraltar, most recently thinking about other bodies of water too. What does it mean to live on water in a world that is going to become increasingly kind of flooded and with issues like sea level rise puncturing our geographical imaginations? And also my primary research project on a Cold War experiment that we're going to come onto a bit later, known as Sealab 1, 2 and 3. And just to provide some context, it's a really exciting time to be a geographer engaging with the space of the sea. For a long time, particularly in Western geographical thought, the undersea environment has been seen as this kind of abstract, empty space beyond the scope of human geography, because we're so used to looking at spaces, obviously given that it's human geography, that are inhabited by humans, city centres, urban geographies, all these kinds of things. The undersea environment typically isn't inhabited by humans in the same way, so it's kind of passed geographical scholarship by in many ways. Again, that's a very kind of Western-centric way of viewing the world. But in the last 20 years or so, this has really changed, and there's been this renewed interest, what's called a kind of ocean turn. In other words, a kind of flood, to excuse the pun, a flood of kind of interest into the sea environment within human geography. So there's now this really amazing body of work exploring the various human geographies of the sea as they unfold on the surface, but also through its depths as well. So increasingly in human geography, we're recognising that the undersea environment is lively, it's vitally important to us as human beings, and this takes place in a number of different forms and ways. The picture at the back of this slide, for example, is alluding to the practice of deep sea mining. Our resource shortages on Earth are becoming increasingly difficult. Things like the turn to electric vehicles and electric products to try and be more green actually involves exploiting ocean resources and resources that are found on the sea floor. So there's debates raging at the moment around the practice of deep sea mining. Again, it's something that is framed as being without human consequence because it happens in remote spaces, but this isn't the case. John Charles, for example, explores that for people in Papua New Guinea, spirits and all kinds of other kind of spiritual geographies inhabit the deep sea. It's far from being without human consequence. You can also think about the environmental consequences of this as well on non-human life. And just to give a really another quick example, we could also think about the prevalence of undersea cables. These are infrastructures that we don't see, that are invisible, and that I think get lost as we talk about how our data is located in the cloud. It kind of sounds like this ethereal thing that exists above us, when in reality, about 90 to 99% of our data is transferred through the undersea environment, through undersea cables. It's around 1.2 million kilometres of them. So every time we're transferring data from our phones, from our laptops, we're connecting to the undersea environment in ways that we don't often think about. And we can turn to historical case studies as well. And this has been one of the key things I've been researching over the last few years. And these are the Sealab experiments, which took place from 1964 to 1969. And I thought I'd share them because I think they provide, I think they're interesting case studies in and of themselves, but I think they also provide a way to plug in to the theme of undersea geopolitics and to think about why it matters and how we can think about the sea and the undersea environment as a space of human geography and not just kind of physical geography in terms of things like driving weather systems. So what was Sealab? You can maybe get a sense of it from the image on this slide, but just to provide some additional context. There was 3 projects, so Sealab 1, 2 and 3. Now, Sea Lab 3 ended quite tragically as the habitat, they had all sorts of problems as they were trying to lower the undersea habitat into the water, and two divers went down to fix it, and one of them tragically died, and it kind of marked the end of the programs. But Sea Lab 1 and Sea Lab 2 were these really extraordinary experiments designed to enable man, and it was always men, or aquanauts as they were known, to live under the surface of the sea without coming back to the surface. So this was for prolonged periods of time, being stationed on the sea floor without the option to just swim to the surface if you needed to. Now, the Office of Naval Research, who are one of the key kind of organisations exploring this research, this was a pioneer effort to support human life and useful activity in the Earth's most hostile environment. And we'll come back to that phrase, hostile, in a second. And this would be achieved via undersea infrastructure, including undersea habitats. So the one you just saw on the image on the previous slide was pretty much what was lowered to the floor. It was this kind of cylindrical, almost like a submarine hull, piece of infrastructure lowered to the seafloor to enable the men to live and dwell inside. Now, they used air pressure to keep the water out, so they didn't need doors or hatches. They could kind of just drop into the sea and climb back into the habitat whenever they wanted to. Now, I think it's important, this isn't the Sea Lab projects just to highlight, but I think it's important to recognise the wider context in which these were taking place. Now, you probably know bits about the Cold War, and often the sea is framed simply as this space of kind of submarine warfare, of covert activity, where submarines kind of glide silently through, or supposedly silently through the sea. But this was also a time of real kind of ocean optimism. What scholars have called ocean boosters were really trying to promote the idea that the sea could almost be the salvation for the human race, with concerns around overpopulation, resource shortages, and of course that ever-looming threat of nuclear warfare. So ocean boosters were trying to frame the sea as a space that could be inhabited, that could be farmed, that could be cultivated, much like land spaces had been. Famous underwater kind of adventurers like Jacques Cousteau, who was a French underwater champion who invented the aqualung, he would say things like, man has to enter the sea to save humans from the kind of shortages that had come about on land. He said things like the aquatic age was soon to come, and this was represented in all kinds of imagery, like you can see in this picture, which is the front cover of a book by Donald Cox on the undersea environment during the Cold War. So the Cold War context was really important. It was all about attacking oceanographic problems. Again, we'll come back to that language of attacking and hostile in a second. To expand military capabilities on the continental shelf. This was important because a few years previously there'd been a resolution on the continental shelf in the United Nations, which said that states have the ability to use the resources located on their continental shelf. And this was like a landmark ruling that gave states sole access to the resources off of their coasts, effectively on the sea floor. So that was really important. And also to better the ability to live and perform useful work in this environment. Again, we hear language associated with ocean boosters, the idea that you can access a treasure trove of resources, food supplies, wealth, and minerals. And there were other imperatives too. So the US Navy had tragically lost one of their submarines and all the lives on board in 1963. That was the USS Thresher. So that there was this increasing recognition that there needs to be more capability for salvage and rescue operations at depth. And interestingly as well, this was, particularly in Sea Lab 2, this was a project designed by the Navy, but oceanographers from Scripps Institute of Oceanography were working alongside the aquanauts to gather data and to better understand this environment. And again, we'll come back to that language of attacking and what that means when we're thinking about this as a space in a second. So just some really quick kind of fact files almost on Sea Lab 1 and Sea Lab 2, just to provide you with a little bit more context, because I realise these are almost quite fantastical projects that seem almost like science fiction rather than historical kind of reality. So both projects were led by Dr. George Bond and Captain Walt Mazzone. Sea Lab 1 took place in 1964, and it was in the waters off the coast of Bermuda. So this was chosen because It was relatively very clear, warm. It was very favourable conditions. If you're going to put an undersea habitat on the seafloor for the first time, they wanted to do it in conditions where the aquanauts had the best possible chance of success and of kind of managing this strange environment. So it was 58 metres down, and it lasted for 11 days. It was due to last longer. There was an impending hurricane, so they kind of evacuated or stopped the projects a bit early. Now, this was to test the feasibility of underwater living and to put into practice experiments that had been conducted in labs before, known as Project Genesis. And there was one team of 4 men, and they lived for 11 days in Sea Lab 1, and it confirmed that undersea living was viable in open water, and all the experiments they'd done beforehand in hyperbaric chambers on land were valid, and that this was something that could be achieved. You can see aquanaut Bob Bass there, just standing outside of the Sea Lab 1 habitat with his thumb up. Now, Sea Lab 2 was the second experiment, and it happened relatively quickly afterwards in 1965. But this time it happened off on the continental shelf of the United States, off the coast of Scripps Institute of Oceanography in California. Now, Scripps were really at the forefront of oceanography and of ocean knowledge, so it was kind of logical that they would do it there and involve oceanographers from the institution. This was slightly deeper, so it was 62 metres, and the duration was much, much longer, so it lasted for 45 days. Now, 3 teams each spent 15 days on the sea floor, but Scott Carpenter spent 30 consecutive days living in Sea Lab 2. And this was interesting because he used to be an astronaut, so he was used to living in kind of confined spaces where you can't easily access Earth. Now, the purpose was to extend the results of Sea Lab 1, but they wanted to do it in much less favourable conditions, so they didn't want to provide the aquanauts with this warm, clear environment because it was unrealistic as to what operations would normally be like, particularly on the US continental shelf. So Sea Lab 2 took place on the US continental shelf, but it was darker, it was colder. The conditions on the sea floor were much more challenging, with lots of silt and also an abundance of marine life, as you can see in those images. It was to conduct rigorous physiological and psychological testing. They wanted to understand how the human body interacted with the environment. What were the stresses, what were the strains being placed on the men's psychology, but also on their physiology as well. They wanted to conduct oceanographic studies, and also, as you can see in the image, the second image down, they wanted to understand how marine mammals could be involved in this process as well. This was called Project Arion and was a key part of the project. And the dolphin, you might be able to see just in that image coming from the top, was a kind of groundbreaking attempt to see if they could train dolphins and later on sea lions to assist the aquanauts in their undersea living experiments. And Tuffy the Dolphin, who we'll come back onto a bit later, was the protagonist of this story and the key kind of non-human actor to assist the aquanauts. And you can see him there. His primary kind of goal was to be able to take a line to a lost diver. So you can see him there coming towards the line. A diver would signal with sonar, and he would carry the line to them. But he also did lots of other tasks as well, as we'll come on to in a second. So just for the last couple of minutes of the lecture, I just wanted to think about how we can think about Sea Lab geographically. Why does it matter to us as geographers, and particularly as human geographers? And I've taken kind of 3 themes from my book that is due to come out very soon to try and kind of drill down into why effectively this matters and what we can gain from thinking about it. Now, the first, I think, is being able to critically engage with the undersea environment as a frontier space. Now, frontier is a really loaded term. It comes with lots of kind of baggage with it. It's associated with historically American expansion into the Wild West. And crucially, in all frontier spaces, they're kind of envisioned as being empty, as being spaces that the white American man can colonize regardless of the life that is already inhabiting those spaces. And the sea wasn't exempt from this narrative. It was kind of framed as being this uninhabited space to be colonized by the American man, and was entangled within wider questions of power and spatial dominance that kind of drove Cold War narratives of the time. Now, I mentioned that we'd come back to the phrases kind of hostile and attack, and this was a really key feature of the US military and US states' strategy during the Cold War. They viewed spaces like the sea, the Arctic, even outer space, as spaces to be attacked. They viewed them as hostile. They could be conquered by military might. And Sealab was no exception to this. It was seen to be this kind of new space, this deepening of the American frontier into kind of three dimensions through which the American man could kind of thrive and show their spatial dominance to their Cold War rivals. And this is really important, I think, because it moves past this narrative that the undersea environment was simply the space of submarine warfare. Actually, it was seen as a frontier, not just a space to move through, but a space to actively kind of inhabit and to dwell within. It was seen as a space to live and to thrive, rather than just this space to move through as you would if you were inhabiting a submarine. And we can see kind of hints of that in the image on the right. This is one of the aquanauts conducting experiments in growing underwater crops. This was all about dwelling, living, making space, making home on the sea floor, rather than, again, seeing it as this transitory space. And this is really important, I think, in kind of complicating our understandings of what the undersea environment is and was at this time, and how we can kind of deepen historical and geopolitical narratives of this as a space. And crucially, I think, I mentioned before that the undersea environment is often presented as being kind of abstract and empty. And often, this obviously is the case when we're thinking about undersea geopolitics. If we're thinking about it in human terms, it is relatively uninhabited. The Sealab projects were exceptional, but they do provide this window into how we can think about the sea differently, how we can engage with it as an inhabited space, and the kind of geographical consequences of that as well. Now, secondly, we might think about the theme of gender. This is a really important kind of concept and theme within geography, whichever space or place that we're thinking or talking about. And the undersea environment was really no exception. Gender was a really key part of the project. It was very much framed, again, thinking about that language of attack and hostility. It was framed as a very masculine environment, and one where the male body would pit himself against the hostilities of the sea. This was about, as I said before, conquering and mastering. And really crucially within this narrative, men and women were framed very differently. The men, again, were framed as these brave risk takers who, as George Bond would say, were taking risks for the benefit of all mankind. Meanwhile, the wives of the aquanauts, known as aqua spouses or aqua wives in George Bond's newsletters, looked on really helplessly and fearfully from the surface, or they fulfilled very stereotypical functions. You can see one aquanaut, Dr. Sonnenberg, in the image on the right. George Bond described him as being fearsomely kind of strong, brave, and kind of conforming to this American ideal of what a man should be. His wife baked him a birthday cake, and it didn't quite make it to the habitat in the best condition, as you can see a little bit on the image. And newspaper reports reported on the kind of immense distress that this caused his wife. She said she'd rather give birth to a child than have her disastrous cake kind of publicised in the media. They were framed as being kind of overly emotional, kind of volatile emotionally, and also fearful as well. And if they weren't kind of framed in that way, then they were framed as kind of sexualized objects. So the aquanauts would talk about women serving as pin-ups in the habitats, as morale boosts in one report. So this was a very gendered project, and I think it raises some really interesting questions about how we conceive of gender in relation to extreme environmental contexts. Now, historically, this is important. As the Sealab projects demonstrates, the gender norms of the time mean that this was extremely gendered. But I think the legacies of that linger on today. So we might think about how environmental contexts, extreme spaces like the undersea environment, like the Arctic, Antarctic, outer space, how these have historically been conceived of as male heterosexual spaces, and why this matters in terms of thinking through how they're used and inhabited today, because the consequences of that certainly linger on and take a lot of time to unravel. And finally, thinking about the relationships between the human and non-human world. Now, I mentioned Tuffy the Dolphin earlier on in the presentation, and he was really the star of Sealab 2. He was known for being a bit kind of rebellious. Tuffy came from, was a kind of shortened version of tough guy, because he was not happy sometimes about being captive. He was caught from the wild, so this was very much an alien environment for him. And Samantha the sea lion also became co-opted in Sealab 2. She was also caught from the wild. She kept visiting the habitat, and psychologists on the surface thought, why don't we try kind of training her? So Tuffy and Samantha were two of the key kind of non-human actors in Sealab 2. Now, interestingly, Tuffy was also kind of embroiled in this gendered language of the projects. In the media, he was kind of valorized for being strong, for having scars, which they kind of said were that he'd survived shark attacks, that he would, protect the aquanauts, and all of these kinds of things. And it was also tied to this wider idea of kind of territory building and taming the environment. If you can master an undersea inhabitant like a dolphin, then you can master the wider space of the sea. So it was all tied up in this idea of conquering, and again, really neglecting the welfare and the ethics associated with entering a space that is already inhabited by a whole range of life. And this extended also to the microscopic organisms circulating through the sea, things like plankton. So George Bond kind of reported on the men dining on plankton soup, which might seem really insignificant, but it all played into that wider kind of rhetoric around the projects that said that these men were kind of capable, they were hardy, they could survive even on the microscopic organisms floating through the sea. And also, non-human lives cause problems as well. So in the preparations for Sealab 3, urchins were framed to be these kind of invading creatures that would cause havoc with the projects. And in Sealab 2, scorpionfish, which blanketed the seafloor around the habitat and were attracted to the habitat by the light emanating from it, caused all sorts of problems because they sting and can really incapacitate, or could have really incapacitated the aquanauts were they to have trodden on them or had their skin come into contact with them. So it wasn't always a straightforward relationship of mastering and conquering. But I think this raises again some really interesting questions about how human and non-human worlds are entangled, how we value different forms of life. Scorpionfish were deemed to be pests, whereas Tuffy was an ally, he was a companion, and framed as a friend to the project. How are our human and non-human worlds entangled? What are the consequences of this? And how can we kind of explore that in the world today? So just to wrap up really, the contemporary relevance of Sealab is fairly multifaceted. It's still quite niche, I guess, but there's some really important things that came from the projects. So firstly, the diving technique that enabled the projects to come about is still used today in kind of undersea construction and maintenance. So yeah, things like undersea cables, to go back to the original example, are maintained by people who use the same diving technique as was developed in Sealab. And interestingly, there's still a couple of undersea habitats in the world. So the Aquarius Reef Base, which is off the coast of Florida, is still used by the US Navy, but also by NASA to train astronauts for life in outer space. And you can see Tim Peake on the left of the screen there with the orange snorkel, preparing for life in the International Space Stations. So the undersea environment was almost like an analogue for outer space. It functioned to kind of replicate weightlessness, to replicate remoteness and an inability to seek help from the outside world very quickly. And actually NASA became interested in the Sealab projects towards the end of them. And I guess one of its other legacies is these yet to be realised visions for underwater research stations and living projects. So Jacques Cousteau's grandson, he is currently trying to bring about a new undersea research station to better understand the ocean environment. And if you have a look There's still kind of proponents of undersea living in various forms, and with climate change, these visions of living under the water have only kind of resurfaced again. So just to conclude with some broader points, I think Sea Lab demonstrates in very kind of profound ways how we can think about the undersea environment as a lively space of human geography, not outside of it. And obviously the Sea Lab experiments are quite unique, and humans don't live on the seafloor in the way that was envisioned by the ocean boosters of the Cold War, but it does provide this kind of this kind of unique example of how we might think about the sea as a space of human geography. And then from that to springboard off into other ways that we are connected with the undersea environment, whether that be through deep sea mining, whether that be through the food we eat, whether that be through the data we transfer through that space. We are intimately connected with this space that is beyond our vision and often our experience. It helps us to refute the idea of the sea as an empty space, or the idea that actions are without consequence. This is an environment that is already inhabited by a whole range of life, and that which humans struggle to survive in. It also helps us engage critically and proactively with how the undersea environment is constructed and imagined. Now, these constructions and imaginaries are really important because they enable or disable certain actions. So in Sea Lab, constructing this as a hostile space to be attacked enabled the Navy to kind of go in there and to disregard kind of the life within it because it was seen as being hostile. If you frame the sea as a kind of friendly and comforting space, probably they wouldn't have viewed undersea life in the same way. And these imaginaries matter still today. We can turn to things like Blue Planet and the types of emotions and feelings that it was designed to kind of prompt in us, and how that then affects how we envisage and how we interact with the undersea environment, how we care for it or not care for it, as the case may be. And crucially, it's an environment that will only become more important, I think, and our awareness of it will only become more important as we realise just the sheer number of ways that it is linked to us and linked to the survival of humanity and linked to our global futures as well. So I'll end there. Thank you for listening, and I hope that's given you some introduction to some of the ways we think about the undersea environment within human geography.